Well, hello, everybody. It's good to see you. Peter and I are going to be presenting today on safe handling guidelines for immersion fluids. So this presentation is actually focused on the output of some of the work Peter just previously described. So it started as a focus group within the Fluids and Materials Working Group. And it was born out of the recognition that this type of guidance, this type of best practice guidance, is actually not easy to find out in the world. And for people that are looking to actually accept and adopt immersion cooling in their own facilities, not having this type of guidance or practical use case examples is really a huge barrier, right? So this is a complicated topic. This is going to be a presentation that covers what led up to our first revision or our first version of this published white paper, and there's a lot more work to do. So we'll talk to you about what the contents of this white paper are and also have a call to action because, like I said, this is complicated. There are going to be a lot more opportunities for us to expand this knowledge base. The motivation for this, as I mentioned, is that lacking this type of guidance is actually a practical barrier, keeping people from feeling comfortable in adopting immersion. Many users in this space, in the general data center space, have never really used fluids. And now we're talking about accepting and adopting water or glycol or oil or fluorocarbons, all sorts of different fluids, right? Historically, fluids are things you wanted to keep as far away from your data center as possible. And now they become an imperative to actually enable more efficient cooling, more sustainable facilities, and so forth. So oftentimes, these data center owner operators don't have a chemist on their team. They don't have a fluid expert on their team. They might not have an industrial hygiene program or a plan of how to actually accept these new technologies. So the other really important factor here is there's a lot of complexity. There are a lot of different styles of immersion cooling systems, a lot of different product types, a lot of fluid types, and it's hard to assess the use case for those different products to make a smart decision. But it's also sometimes hard to connect the practicalities of your decision with implications into how you actually operate your facility and implement that technology long term. Additionally, there are no specific immersion-focused industry standards, building codes, and similar. And that's really difficult, right? So this is a barrier to adopting new cooling technologies as well. And it relies, or it forces the owner-operator to actually do some legwork on their own. So that's where the OCP community really wanted to step up, provide that initial guidance in a variety of different ways. This presentation is focused on safety. If you stick around, I'll be talking about our failure mode effect analysis work, which is focused on a different aspect of safety. But all of it really is intended to help people to actually adopt immersion cooling and have best practice guidance and documentation to support their efforts. Now, when we look at the output, this white paper, I mentioned there being a lot of complexity. There are a lot of fluid types that are used in immersion cooling. And so this white paper cannot possibly cover everything. The approach that we've taken is to try to set and maintain a certain scope for what is in consideration for this draft and what is out of consideration for this draft, maybe on the table for the future. And the output right now, what I would consider is practical guidance, and we try to take a universal approach as much as we could so that as many people in the audience, in the community, would benefit from this as possible. So in scope for our first draft of this white paper are fresh and uncontaminated base oils. So it's considering the product as it arrives on site and not products, for instance, that have been contaminated or have started decomposing for whatever reason, where some kind of issue has occurred. That's something that is important, but for a later draft. We're considering both single and two-phase fluids, recognizing that there are adopters of both technologies out there, and we want to enable both. In scope also are common fluid types and hazards. So we've gone through the effort of actually defining several different classes of fluids, and for those broad classes, trying to assign common characteristics, features, and best practice guidance that are associated with them. So some level of specificity with the products that are involved. And finally, the output, we intended to create universal best practices. So how to properly use, store, and dispose of these products at the end of their life. Finally, we also tried to tackle some universal requirements when it comes to facility-level SPCC. If you have a spill for your product, what should you do? What type of PPE should you have on site? For people like Peter and myself, we spent many years in grad school in research labs doing chemistry, and the conditions that we were doing those experiments in were very high temperature, with very sensitive chemicals, with very, very reactive chemicals. So for us in this environment, we think, wow, this is very low temperature. These products are relatively innocuous in many cases. But for people who aren't used to chemistry, aren't used to fluids, they might not know how to clean up a spill. Can I use a paper towel? Can I use water? Does water clean up oil? The answer is not very well. So we wanted to make sure that we covered the basics. So for people that don't have PhDs in chemistry, the basics may not be so basic. Out of scope, as I mentioned, things that have been contaminated or have decomposed, cascade failure scenarios, specific product guidance, which you should get by consulting with your product vendor, differences in global approaches. We did not delve into building code differences region to region, for instance, and a deep dive into specific codes or standards. So really quickly, I want to highlight a couple of key insights that really led to us prioritizing this work output. These are things that maybe people in this crowd appreciate, or maybe they don't. Maybe they're not aware. The first is that the safety data sheet, or the SDS, is a document that describes all hazards or considerations related to using fluid products, but also for every possible use of that product that is foreseeable. So the fluid manufacturer creates an SDS for every end use of that product, and it turns out that the oils that are frequently used in these applications also are used in a variety of other applications. This is really important. Some of those applications involve intentional spraying or misting or dripping, things that you wouldn't see at all in an immersion application. The reason why that's important is because if you're intentionally misting an oil in some other industry, in some other application, you might see some warnings or hazards in your SDS associated with inhalation of mist. And so it's really important as a user to be able to look at the SDS and appreciate that some of the hazards are more relevant to your use case, and some are maybe less relevant to your use case. They may not all apply, and they may. And that's where it's really important when you select your fluid product that you talk with the vendor and you say, look, I see this SDS, help me to build this plan, help me to understand the hazards associated with my particular use case. Okay, so that's the first thing. And I think that's an aha for some people because they look at the SDS and they don't necessarily appreciate it's written for every possible application of that fluid. The second thing is maybe also obvious, maybe not so obvious, is that you should have a plan. When you bring immersion cooling systems into your facility, you should have a plan. You should make sure that it's functional and operational, that it has the connections that it needs, but you also should have a plan on how you're going to clean up a spill if it happens. What happens if you have a leak? What happens if you have a failure? And this is something that you do in every other element of your facility. This might just be a new application for you and something new that you have to consider. So single-phase immersion systems have a lot of advantages, but they also are going to require you to do an update to your facility plan, making sure that people are properly trained, are using proper PPE when necessary, and that proper storage and handling guidance is actually part of your training when users are actually entering the workplace. Regarding the safe handling guidance, one of the things that we have outlined in this white paper specifically is guidance for addressing a spill plan. This is something that everybody should do. And like I said, our approach is to try to be as universal as possible here. So to try to approach a spill plan by identifying common features that each facility should actually have documented on site, And again, consulting the vendor for their particular fluid can help to really shine a light on some of the nuances depending on which product you select. So things like PPE, absorbent material to actually soak up the oil, if there's a solvent that's required to clean it, if there's some type of exposure risk or inhalation risk, if there's any environmental considerations, and also a facility map, so making sure that you've identified important locations across your facility. And the last thing here, just shown in these images, is also the scale of a spill is important. So this is something that we really do highlight as well. If you have a small little drip, it's very easy to clean up with a rag. If you have a larger spill, then you need something like an absorbent boom, which is shown in the picture on the right. So those things are really, really important. They're all in this white paper. I'm going to hand it over to Peter, and he's going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the contents that are in this document.
Thanks, Amy. Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of the content of the white paper, here you can see an outline of the major sections in the document. So first and foremost, I know it sounds boring, but glossary was actually a really important section in this document because we are talking about so many different types of fluids, and the terminology there is a little bit loose. So what do we mean by a synthetic hydrocarbon, for example? So that's actually quite an important section for this document. Then we have an introduction where we outline the scope, some of the things that Amy touched on earlier, what's in scope, what's out of scope. And then in terms of the main content of the document, so first we have a section that's describing all of the hazards associated with these different classes of fluids. So primarily for this revision at least, we focused on synthetic hydrocarbons, esters, both natural and synthetic, and fluorochemical fluids, and that's encapsulating all of the fluorochemical fluids, right? So here we were just talking about what would be the typical hazards associated with those base fluids, right? And then we also touched on formulated blends, although it wasn't a major focus of this revision. We touched on the impact that formulating and adding additives might have on some of those hazards. Next, we have sections on safe handling, product storage, and disposal. So here we describe things like what are best practices for doing transfers between tanks or in and out of storage containers, avoiding things like static discharge. That's a very important topic. Product storage as well, what's best practice in terms of product storage? I've seen some people, again, maybe unfamiliar with these types of fluids, who will go and store their fluid outside in the sun all year round, right? You can probably imagine what might happen, right? And then disposal, that's related to the previous topic on fluid life cycle management, but you know, what are best practices in terms of disposal? Again, generalizing a little bit, always consult your fluid vendor, but some general guidelines. Spill procedures, Amy touched on the importance of that previously. And then the last section is cleaning procedure, and here although it wasn't the main focus of this document, I hope we can create a separate white paper that goes into more detail. We do provide a little bit of guidance around cleaning procedures, which I'll explain on the next slide. So key takeaways, this is kind of the last point that we'll really touch on here, but key takeaways from this document for me, four key takeaways. Firstly, as Amy mentioned, it's really important to review safety documentation. So firstly, consulting with the vendor and asking any questions, right? Because the vendor is the one who's going to have the best and most accurate information for that particular fluid that you're going to use. And then based on that, always have a plan, right? So you know, to be aware of things like spill procedures, ventilation requirements, PPE, etc. That will all be outlined in that type of documentation, and that will feed into the standard operating procedures that you need to have in your data center. Next key takeaway, where appropriate PPE. So again, we were generalizing a little bit here, but I think this is going to be pretty common across all the different types of fluids. So things like gloves, safety glasses, closed toe shoes, and protective clothing. Those are really important, right? And I know in the past, maybe, you know, in the early days, those things haven't been included as standard PPE, but I think now that we're professionalizing more and more as an industry, that really is important to have in all SOPs. Third thing is design building controls, right? So building controls, taking into account those hazards. You know, there are no deal breakers here, but there are definitely things that need to be taken into account. So just to highlight a couple of those points, appropriate ventilation. Just about every immersion system will need some type of ventilation. The fluids will evaporate at some point, so in any open systems, there needs to be appropriate ventilation. And spill plans, as we touched on before, that's really important and will be a regulatory requirement in a lot of different jurisdictions. The last key takeaway that I wanted to touch on is use compatible cleaners. So again, we looked at briefly some of the practices in industry today around how to clean servers as well as tanks. And it was interesting, there were a lot of different approaches and methods here. So people using different types of bases and things. I think the general consensus, however, was, and we did a review of all those different types of bases, so you'll see a table with pros and cons of each type. I think the general consensus is, though, that they should be dielectric to avoid any contamination issues afterwards, in case there are trace amounts of the cleaner left on the surfaces of the servers. And to also take into account the safety hazards associated with the use of those cleaners, so especially, you know, avoiding flammable products, right? So future work, I think Amy kind of outlined this a little bit earlier. In terms of the out-of-scope items, there are a lot of out-of-scope items for this revision, which will be important in the future. First, we'd like to get feedback from the community, especially vendors and end users, right, who have a lot of first-hand experience with this. We have already started sharing out the draft document. It hasn't been published yet with some people, and so far the feedback's very good. A lot of suggestions for improvement, so that's good to see. Alignment with the standards bodies, so that's a common theme across OCP, but it's particularly important here. Fluids after usage, they're contaminated and disposed, you know, what to do with those. And then in-depth cleaning guidelines, which, like I've mentioned, will be a separate white paper in the future. So just to finish, call to action. Feel free to welcome when this is published. It should be published, I didn't mention that, but it should be published hopefully in the next couple of months, pending the review process of OCP. So please use this document as a tool and a safety conversation starter. So, you know, when you're looking at doing immersion deployments, I think this will be a valuable document to use as an overall guide. And please give us any feedback for the future revisions. If you want to get involved in that conversation, there are two work streams you can join into. The first is the fluids and materials work stream, and secondly, the requirements work stream, and here are the links to the mailing list. And with that, I'd like to thank you all, and I think we have time for one question or two questions.
We have a break that begins now for 15 minutes, but if people need to have some questions, let's do it.
Okay, thanks. One or two questions, if there are any.
So labels on IT equipment, that's, I know that we don't have, they're a damn nuisance, aren't they, for immersion, yeah. I mean, they use different glues, I guess, and things like that. I mean, how do we get around that from the I know it's a safety thing. It's not that you're talking about safety here, but I just wondered whether that was an aspect that you covered at all. Can we get them to stop using labels?
John, which material? Labels. Oh, labels and adhesives. Yeah. Labels and adhesives are something that come up quite a bit, and I actually think it's something that's tackled as part of the fluids and materials work group, is to talk through compatibility. So that's one also where it's a little bit difficult to give universal guidance, because if you have fluorochemistry involved, or if you have hydrocarbons involved or esters involved, The like dissolve like principle is very different, right? So they're going to have very different compatibility profiles. So that is not something that is something we can universally suggest or recommend, unless if you want to create a tag that actually connects outside of the fluid, or if you etch the side of your equipment. So other than those things, removing it from the fluid or actually permanently etching into the server itself, like a VIN number or something like that. Otherwise, talk to the vendor, yeah.
As a follow-up on that, yeah, maybe I can, sorry, is it okay to speak? So, yeah, anybody else? So IMEC are doing, I don't know if you know IMEC in Belgium. They on the fab side of things, and they've been looking at trying to put an odometer in, like an odometer you have in your car, in the server. So, what temperatures has it seen? What, how much workload has it done, etc. So that kind of identification could be useful in this case for immersion, and maybe we need to try and get those guys involved in this somehow, yeah, because that's something that they're looking at in embedding it in the microelectronics somehow.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and it'll also be important for that subsequent conversation, which we've kind of postponed, about what happens when fluids start getting contaminated, right? I think that it will be important for multiple reasons, but it will help feed into that as well. Any more questions? If we've got time. Yeah. One more.
Hi, thank you. Just because of Mouthtope. A question or observation about the PPE and another safety provision. We work with many different fluid vendors, and we see a lot of inconsistency as to what's on that safety data sheet, even the same category of chemical. Here, we're wanting to sell to the data center industry. We're not selling to the chemical industry. So one fluid manufacturer may say gloves are optional, wash hands after handling. Another manufacturer would want a full face shield. They'd want there to be an emergency shower next to the people handling the fluid. And what we need is an objective view. What hazard does that particular fluid provide to the operator? Because if you're requiring a safety shower, you're not going to sell a lot of that product to the data center industry. So interested in any comments on that inconsistency, because it's a different market. I can see if you're selling to the chemical industry, people are very used to taking a lot of safety precautions. Are they really necessary?
Yeah, thanks. So I think that's a great question, and I'll take a stab at answering, and then I might hand over to Amy. I think that was kind of the intent of this document, was to establish a baseline when there wasn't a baseline previously, right? So you did see, people using no PPE or a lot of PPE, right? And so I think our intent was to at least establish this minimum amount of PPE, which would be common across most fluids. The only challenge I see ultimately is coming back to what Amy mentioned in the introduction. Each individual fluid might have its own particular safety concerns, right? And that's going to be formulation dependent. So there could be formulations which require more PPE or different types of PPE as opposed to others. And I think I agree with the intent of that. I just see that as a challenge that we'll have to also deal with, those variations between fluids. So yeah, I don't know, Amy, if you wanted to add anything.
I wanted to emphasize something. You said there's a professionalization in the industry around immersion cooling. I feel like an old timer in this industry, and and it's not even really been that long, right? The pace at which people are adopting immersion has accelerated quite a bit in recent years. And I think with that comes the increased participation of more professional participants in this space and more guidance in this space on what the product features are. I think gone are the days where you just buy something on Amazon and hope for the best, or throw something from your kitchen pantry into your little server tank, right? I think people now have options to be able to go out and to purchase fluids from an established participant in this ecosystem. And there should be an expectation that every user has that when they engage with these vendors, they should be able to have a professional and very focused conversation on any hazards associated with that product. And look, some of these products have different safety recommendations than others. Many of these products are relatively innocuous and can be used and operated in a very safe way with minimal additional effort. But training is important, documentation is important, and consulting the vendor and getting good feedback from the vendor is important. So if you're a user that's out there and interested in adopting immersion cooling, and you're talking to a vendor who cannot give you or will not give you specific guidance on their product, then I would suggest you seek other vendors, truly, because this is something that should be established in this industry. So the approach, if we tie back into this white paper, the approach that we've taken is to try to rationalize the why behind the requirement. So you might want to avoid contact with your skin. What that means is it's up to you to assess how high the gloves have to be based on your particular use case. So we might not go into the specifics for your use case, but we might explain the why. Make sure that your PPE doesn't absorb the chemistry of the fluid. Make sure that your PPE is a length that prevents contact with your skin. So that's the type of approach that we've taken, and it allows you, as the user or prospective user, to be armed with the right questions to actually go into the vendor and to have those really important conversations. So for people who are totally unfamiliar with fluids, our hope is that you read this document and you know now what questions to ask, and you know now what things you need to do to prepare your facility. And hopefully that also helps to reduce the barrier to adoption of this technology, because it isn't really that big of an extra lift. All right, thank you all. I think now we have actually a scheduled break.